Well then, good Monday everyone, good start of the week. What we have to talk about in the start of the week is something related, but not too closely, to the release of this 9.1.5 patch, because as you know, we as a people are a needy bunch. So, as soon as we have gathered all the information for this new patch, as soon as Blizzard released the official date for the patch, which is November 2nd. To be fair, some experts are arguing that the real date of the release of this patch is going to be December the 7th, because that's when the Time Walking event is going to come out, but that's a subject for another discussion. What is going to happen after this is that the next focus of attention is going to be 9.2. Where is it? How far away is it? When is it going to come out? Because yes, sure, 9.1.5 is bringing a quality of life wave of things. Again, in a more cynical way, people could say that many of these things should have been part of the game since the release. Many of these things have been told to Blizzard in the alpha, and then in the beta they have been mentioned as being problematic and sure to cause troubles to the player base for months, and then Blizzard is now releasing them now, basically a year later, a year after the release of the expansion. So, you know, the usual trick of withholding good changes from the release of your product only to then swoop in with a hotfix, with a patch, and pretend to be praised is as old as time. And it's not that people fall for that often anymore, but nevertheless, it is still a patch with a bunch of quality of life, etc., etc. But where is the next content? The real matter of this subject is that we still don't have a date, we still don't have any type of leaks and possible whispers about the 9.2 patch. We have talked about this weeks and weeks ago before we even knew too much of anything about 9.1.5, about the possibility / some might say the danger of this expansion being given the Warlords of Draenor treatment. Now, if you are an inexperienced new player, or if you simply knew better and you just decided not to play Warlords because it was dog shit is the scientific term, what happened in Warlords of Draenor is that Blizzard completely botched essentially the development of the entire expansion, and midway through they gave up. This is not actually an exaggeration or a joke. It was a pretty unique expansion where it released with a single very tiny raid, which was Heimel. It was also one of the few expansions where the second raid, which was supposed to be the first big raid tier, which was Blackrock Foundry, was actually already in the game. It didn't come out in its own patch, it didn't have its own extension of the campaign or anything like that. It was just enabled, it was just unlocked a few months after the release of Warlords and Heimel. And then after that, there was only one major patch, which was Tanan Jungle with Hellfire Citadel as a raid. And that was the only thing. Blizzard basically said, sorry guys, we messed up. We are going to spend our next foreseeable future developing Legion instead. The fear that this expansion, Shadowlands, was going to take this path compared to the other two relatively content-rich expansions we have had after Warlords, both Legion and BFA were actually pretty steady in their amount of content. They pretty much had a very one-to-one release schedule, because Legion launched with a somewhat tiny raid like Emerald Nightmare, and so did BFA with Uldir. There was a tiny 3-boss mini raid thrown out in between, Trial of Valor and Crucible of Storms. And then there was the first big raid tier, Nighthold and Battle of the Zarlor, followed by Tomb of Sargeras and Eternal Palace, followed at the end by Antorus and Nyalotha. In the middle, you also had extra zones. In Legion, you had the Broken Shore, and followed up by Argus. In BFA, you had Mechagon and Najatar double zone at the release of Eternal Palace, and then you had the two reworked zones, the Valley of Eternal Springs and Uldum, reworked for the Nyalotha invasion mechanics, etc., etc. In Legion, you also had the Mage Tower Challenge minigame, and in BFA, you had the Horrific Visions minigame. Not to mention the Karazhan Mega Dungeon in Legion and the Mechagon Mega Dungeon in BFA. So, as you see, pretty much a one-to-one conversion significantly different than Warlords. However, this expansion has not really gone the same way, to the point that the first patch, the 9.1 patch, was delayed so much that it turned out to make the release of Shadowlands the longest ever base version of the game, base content patch essentially, of any other titles of WoW. No other expansion lasted as long. Shadowlands is actually almost 2 months longer than the second longest, the other previous owner of this title, which was Wrath of the Lich King. Now, the problem with this is that we could have excused this on the first patch, especially if you throw in things like the COVID pandemic, the work from home situation that struck Blizzard, just like it struck many other companies. That might have been an excuse. So, fine, okay. But then 9.1 releases and you start looking at the timeline of this expansion. If you wanted to keep up with the pattern of the last couple of expansions, Legion and BFA, the expansion is going to last a couple of years, tops. To be fair, this couple of years per expansion has actually been a thing since TBC. Most of the expansions have lasted roughly 2 years. So this means that once 9.1 launched at the start of July, you technically had from July 2021 to November 2022. So you had somewhere around 16 months left to the expansion. So you have 3 patches you have to develop, 3 patches that you have to split this time with. 9.1, the one you just released, and then a 9.2 and 9.3. Normally, with 16 months left, if you release 9.2 after 5 months and then 9.3 after 5 months, you're gonna have 6 months left before the end of the expansion, which is still tight. It is still not a long time for a last patch, barely 200 days, not even 200 days. It is a significantly shorter time than other end game patches. Just to give you some numbers, the last patches of the last expansions, BFAs lasted 314 days, Legions was 350, Warlords was 430, Mists was 450. Having a last tier, a 0.3 patch last for just 200 days would have been pretty tight, pretty narrow in terms of timings, but there was still hope, provided this 9.1 patch wouldn't drag on too long. Where is the problem in all of this? The problem in all of this happens when we started getting the news of 9.1.5, which is great. It's expected to get a X.5 patch in between major patches. Cool. The problem is that we start getting news that this patch is going to be bigger than usual. This patch is not going to be your typical mid-patch with just a few quality of life additions and changes and then a bunch of balance tuning and class tuning like we have gotten before. You know, a classic patch of this magnitude is something that Blizzard did in BFA, for example, adding and updating things like the Children's Week, micro holidays like the Wanderers Festival, the Vashir's Diving Day, or perhaps adding Warlords to the Time Walking Pool, adding portal rooms to Stormwind and Orgrimmar, introducing the return of the Brawlers Guild, remastering Warsong Gulch and Arathi Basin. You know, these are the level of very minor, tiny additions you expect for this type of 0.1, 0.5 patch. Instead, we start reading and hearing that this patch is going to be larger. There is even going to be content in this patch, which is pretty unheard of for a mid-patch between a 0.1 and a 0.2 patch, so it was kind of big. At first, you feel good. At first, it's nice that you get extra things that you did not expect before, right? But then you start thinking. Okay, so if this patch is bigger than usual, what's gonna happen to 9.2? We're even getting a pretty long PTR session for this type of patch, which is also unusual. And the first thing that popped to my mind when I saw this unique type of content rollout in this patch was the fact that 9.2 was going to be further away than expected, so Blizzard needed a slightly meatier, thicker patch to bridge the gap, to pass the time, which is why so much stuff has been introduced in 9.1.5. Otherwise, if 9.2 was 2 months away, there would have been a need to release this entire patch. Which then begs the question, if 9.1 was released at the start of July, the release of 9.1.5 is going to be 4 months into 9.1. So, when exactly is 9.2 going to be after that? We have made a nice little graph a while ago talking about what was going to be the max possible release date for 9.2 to not be the longest second tier ever. Because Shadowlands already held the title of longest ever first tier that they won with 9.0, so we wondered what was going to take for Shadowlands to become a back-to-back champion and also gain the longest ever 0.1 patch. The final number was January 11th, matching and beating BFA for the longest ever second tier. So, first of all, let's just excuse BFA a little bit, because the second tier of BFA at the very least also had a mini raid like the Crucible of Storms in the middle. And on top of that, not to mention that the first raid tier, the first patch of BFA lasted 90 days less than Shadowlands. It's as if 9.1 effectively launched at the end of March. So you had much less time to grow bored of the first part of the game, the first patch of the game, and jump into the second one. Whereas in Shadowlands, you had to wait 7 months for 9.1. So given we have an ultimatum for this record stopping at January the 11th, then begs the question, is it even remotely possible that 9.2 is going to release before that? No, the answer is no. There's not going to be any speculation about it. It's not going to happen whatsoever. Even if we don't look just how long Blizzard has taken to release 9.1 and to release 9.1.5, even if we just look at the average time that the other previous patches of the past 6 years, how much they have taken, how long they have taken in the PTR, the average for big patches, so 0.1, 0.2 and 0.3 patches, has been somewhere in the realm of a little over 2 months. This means that even if it were to come early January, you would have to have the PTR starting to launch by early November. Early to mid-November, you should already have announcements, leaks, and notes about the upcoming 0.2 patch. So I guess that's going to be the definite deadline for the 9.2 patch. If in a couple of weeks tops you don't see and hear any news about the patch, it's pretty much impossible that it's going to come out that quickly. This is then going to bring out worse horizons, because people's speculations weren't even remotely close to the 11th of January for this patch. They were closer to things like March or even April, which does indeed seem like an absurd number, because if 9.1 came out at the start of July, we would be talking about a second patch that is going to last over 8 months. So that's going to be somewhere in the realm of, again, 90 or so days longer than the second longest second tier of any other expansion, which was the one in BFA, Battle of Draenor. This would also freely answer you the question about whether or not there is going to be a 9.3 patch, because we said at the start that if the timeline of Blizzard is a 2-year long expansion, then the end of the expansion should be somewhere around November, December of next year. So if this 9.2 patch has to come out somewhere between February and March, then it means that there is absolutely no time for any other patch besides perhaps the pre-patch of the next expansion. And this is going to close our dissertation about this with essentially the title of this video, which is the fact that you have effectively paid 155 euros or $181 for 1 full year of an expansion, the entirety of 2021, to receive one major content patch. If you are one of the people who looks to make a deal and buy 6-month subs instead of subbing month by month, then you still spent 132 euros or $155 for the entirety of the 2021 cycle of this expansion. So in an entire year and nearly 150 euros or dollars, you have gotten one patch, which is 9.1. That's the major one you have gotten. 9.0.5 was a few months before, 9.1.5 is going to be a few months after, but as far as content goes, extension to the story, new raids, new dungeons, etc., new gear, new mechanics and whatnot, it was just one patch in 1 year. And you can see from the graph, you can see from our timeline of the game that this has never even remotely close to have happened, except for the end of the expansion. The end of the expansion is in fact a pretty normal thing for this to happen. You can see the days that the last tier lasted in all the previous expansions being very long and much longer than the start of the game, but you also have to consider that in that end of the game you are getting the pre-patch to the next expansion and you are getting several months of beta of the next expansion. So hype, news, interest for the next version of the game lasting for months. In the Shadowlands version, for example, the beta of Shadowlands went on for somewhere around 6 months. If we count alpha and beta together, yes, BFA's last patch, Nyalota, lasted 314 days, but for over half of those days you had the beta of Shadowlands running at the same time in the background. So as far as this gap goes, as far as this 1 year gap goes, Shadowlands is pretty much the only one that is going to have this title. And unfortunately, as we have just seen, they are starting to hold quite a lot of negative titles. First, from the longest ever first patch of a game in 9.0, now almost certainly they're also going to hold the second title, which is going to be the longest ever second tier of any other expansion, and very likely they are now going to hold the title of having a single major content patch in 1 year. And that was all, really. That was all I wanted to point out today. I was in a kind of a negative mood, so I think the video was going to strike a pretty fitting note. I understand, honestly, the dissatisfaction and the delusion on many players, and why would you even want to stop playing? As a matter of fact, I wouldn't even invite you to keep playing unless you have something that really interests you in the game. Myself, for example, I know I can't compare what I do with what the majority of the player base does if we just look at numbers, because if I enjoy mythic raiding, effectively anything else that goes on in the game is irrelevant to me. All I do is log in to raid and I'm happy, but I'm sure many other people, especially the ones that don't care too much about raiding or Mythic Plus or PvP and just want to have a feel of being part of a grander, wider world with story, campaigns, progression, multiple ways to progress your character in the open world, as well as instance content, etc., etc. Many people will feel dissatisfied by this, and the solution is not that complicated. You can just not play. It's not that if you let your sub run out until you see or think that the game is interesting, your character is going to get deleted. It's not too bad of a decision. I still think it's worth, honestly, to try out 9.1.5, even if just to stick it to the systems of this game that prevented you from trying all the different covenants for a long time. I do want and I do wish to try out the other covenants I haven't tried in the longest time, because the last time I did was in the beta, so I think it's gonna be worth to play 9.1.5, but we all know, given this timeline, that very likely after 9.1.5 you will have to wait somewhere in the realm of 4 months for 9.2. So yeah, sure, try the new patch, but I'm pretty sure that within a few weeks, especially after the time walking event of Legion ends in mid-December, when you're being told, okay, now sit tight for 3.5 more months before 9.2 comes out, you know, that's gonna be pretty much a deal breaker again, even if you came back in the first place. So this was all of the depressing news, which is the trend lately that we had to point out for today. As always, thank you for watching the video, and if you want to continue supporting the channel, or start to, if you weren't in the first place, you can leave a like on the video, comment down below about your level of disappointment for this expansion in a scale from 1 to Warlords of Draenor, as well as, if you feel so inclined, subscribing to the channel, but only if you have a driver's license. Otherwise, you cannot. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, tonight is time for some horse meat. I remember eating it because my grandma used to cook it, so now I'm gonna try and see if my taste is still the one as when I was a kid.